SportsLit is co-founded and co-hosted by Neil Acharya and Nate Sager. Technical producer and engineer, Michael Ella. Executive producer, Neil Acharya.
Hey. Dr. Tiffany Brown and Katie Steele are on this episode. They are the lead authors, collaborating with Erin Strout on The Price She Pays, Confronting the Hidden Mental Health Crisis in Women's Sports, from the Schoolyard to the Stadium. This book was released June 18th, 2024 by Little Brown and Spark. I am Nathan Sager, and I approve of this cold open. As a fan and a feminist, obviously I love the boom in women's sports. What took so long? Now, there is always going to be uneasiness, like when you see that growth expressed only in terms of, dollars, team valuations, TV ratings points, or a news item about an athlete heartily endorsing an event and or product. I understand money makes the world go round, but let's not punt on humanity. In this case, humanity equals mental health. Fortunately for you, you don't have to listen to me blather on about it, because Dr. Tiffany Brown and Katie Steele have done heavy lifting on this for at least a decade. They and collaborating author Erin Strout have built on that to write The Price She Pays, affirming that truly healthful growth of women's sports must move step by step with an athlete-first approach to mental health. They have synthesized their lived experience and used their skills as marriage and family therapists to garner and analyze hundreds of case histories from current and former high-performance female-identified athletes. And I think now is a good time to, dive into this, as heavy as it is. We're early into this growth cycle of women's sports. I think this is just the beginning, but we're also not that far removed from horrific abuse scandals from the Me Too era, which have hopefully changed the sports world positively and permanently, and made people realize, you don't need toxic people around just because they happen to have a talent for one thing. Some background on the guests: both Brown and Steele are based in Oregon. Each of them is a licensed marriage and family therapist. They each put that therapy training and experience into practice by driving the bus with the nonprofit Athletes Mental Health Foundation, where Steele is the founder and Brown is the chief science officer. Steele was a NCAA D1 cross-country and track and field competitor who endured acute trauma response that stemmed from her time as a runner. So she knows of what she speaks, as does Brown, who provides, mental health consultation at the University of Oregon. So yeah, we do need a content and trigger warning on this episode. And I don't think there was anything in the book that really shocked me, because I always, say retain the capacity for shock for how, coldly someone can be treated when they have mental health challenges. But it's unsparing. There's discussion about depression and suicide and anxiety disorders. The book, and hopefully we'll get into it in conversation, it stretches into how in the wider world there's coordinated attacks, through legislatures and the courts on bodily autonomy and gender-affirming care in the post-Roe United States. And because that toxicity always tends to ooze into Canada, it's like a rock just below the waterline up here. Have to talk about it. What girls and women in sports face, in fact, compelled Brown, Steele, and Strout to include an 11-page appendix of additional resources. I'll add to that. Remember, you can always get help in the United States and Canada by dialing 988 if you're in crisis. Now, as somber as all that seems, I thought The Price She Pays, much like Madeline Orr's Warming Up that we covered in the last episode, it's optimistic, even while it's detailing those existential threats. And we've had male guests who have been willing to be vulnerable, but say, hey, I'm not trying to tear anything down. I'm just trying to make it better and more humanistic. Think of Justin Davis with Conflicted Scars in the spring of 2023, or Corey Hirsch in the fall of 2022 with The Save My Life, or Brant Myers with Painkiller in 2021, to name a few. If I was trying to thread all those titles together, I would think they show that sports can be a connector and a place for finding yourself and finding your people for life, even if dealing with, rigid institutions leaves you dented. Remember, Justin Davis said he set out to write his book because he wanted his children to have a record of why daddy is the way he is sometimes. And he also wanted to let others know that hockey players do not have to tolerate what he had to tolerate back in his day, because life's not a suffering Olympics. Just because you went through something when you were, let's say, 17 years old doesn't mean today's 17-year-olds have to put up with it. And yes, I know sometimes it got hot in school when you were a kid too. So when notice of the price she pays landed in our inbox, we thought, this is a must-cover book. There's all this energy and excitement around women's sports, and I think deep examination is a way to complement it, because anything that's that much fun is also worthy of that kind of introspection. Brown, Steele, and Strout go life phase by life phase in sort of delineating a proper mental health first approach for girls in sports. They point out that, outcomes with the way sports are organized these days for boys and girls aren't that good. Children often tend to quit and they find it stressful. It should be joyful. There's a lot in there that would be helpful to parents who are, say, just introducing sports to their, tiny human, like my 3-year-old niece. Hi, Riley. Or ones who say are having a heart-to-heart with their 12-year-old about staying in sports and ignoring the mean girls at school. With girls, if you think back to the recent discussion we had with Ivanka Osmak about her children's book, Alley Hoops, there can be a real hesitancy to try something new and practice without mastery. And that's a social stigma, one you put on yourself, really, that I relate to as a neurodivergent man. You don't want to look bad. Left unchecked, that can spiral to perfectionism, where one's standards get so high they cease to be useful. And that's for things that you're actually good at. And all my life, I've, sort of took that as a reason to root for girls and women's sports and root for it to be bigger and more respected. I figured whatever stigma I faced as someone who, didn't really fit in was trebled or quadrupled or quintupled for women in sports, or ones going into other so-called male-dominated realms like government and business. Why? Well, as the troika of authors who wrote this book remind us, those are social institutions, quote, created by men and for men. Some of those other stigmas that a girl's going to have to overcome to do sports, one of them's appearance-based. How's my body going to look when I'm doing all this physical exertion, or if I put on muscle, or if I don't look as, lean as the others? There's peer pressure through homophobic and transphobic stereotypes. There's also the physiological element, and the book does have sections on, menstruation and pregnancy and reproductive rights. There's also, the double standards in the court of public opinion. When it doesn't go well, sexism comes out. Suddenly, someone's gender becomes an issue when a way it say doesn't with a male. With the Paris Olympics coming up, it's good to remember 7 of 8 cases in online abuse during the last Summer Games were directed at female athletes. And as the authors detail, a lot of teams, coaches, athletic directors, sport organizations are not wired to handle this. They have all sorts of resources for physical injuries, but not so much for mental illness, which kind of is a reflection of our own healthcare systems. I mean, mostly, they're set up to be transactional. They want to feast on the sweet nectar of victory and profits. And by the way, how's that going for the NCAA right now? It's looks like a bit of a dumpster fire. And one hates to see it. But if they ever want to, try to get back on the rails and take it down to the studs, they're welcome to come to Canada and look at our university sport model. So I thought, the price that she pays really substantiates, how Women in sports aren't getting everything they need, but it's also, again, an affirmation that shows why you need the growth mindset and why you should go out there and find people who come at things with good faith and openness. Sort of harkens back to Perdita Felician's memoir, My Mother's Daughter, that we covered here in 2021. How her mom, Catherine, always said, don't fill your life with foolishness. And that seems like a reason to give as little oxygen as possible to the rage farmers, co-opting Caitlin Clark in their highly lucrative grifts. A second part to that comes from Ken Dryden's The Class that Neil Acharya and I covered this spring. As Dryden put it, after age 50, you learn being kind is the most important thing in life. How is it kind to not give someone the care that and attention that they need? It isn't very kind at all, and that's a line in the sand we all need to draw. One other related episode, obviously, in 2022, Susie Rack discussed her history of women's soccer, a women's game. Now, as a reminder, all the episodes and links to buy any of the books that Neil Acharya and I have read since 2017, they're all available at sportslit.ca. And momentarily, Dr. Tiffany Brown and Katie Steele will discuss the price she pays. Okay, we are back with Dr. Tiffany Brown and Katie Steele. Welcome to SportsLit.
Thanks for having us. Nice to meet you, Nathan.
First off, tell us, you had a launch event in New York City last night. What was the reception and reaction relative to what you might have been anticipating?
It was great. We had a full house. We did an event with the New York Roadrunners and had a panel discussion about our new book, The Price She Pays, and we're able to, be in a great conversation with a lot of attendees. It was an exciting way to launch our book.
Mm-hmm. How about for you, Katie?
It was incredible. It was so fun to get to finally meet a lot of the team that we've been working with in person for the first time. And The Price She Pays has really been this collective effort. And so getting to be with people who contributed and helped bring it to life was really special.
Yeah. And then right now off the hop in the book, you sort of described this as the spur to do this. It started 10 years ago at a spin class, I understand.
Yeah, we started, in conversation. We'd stand outside of this gym for, quite a long time after we'd work out and, talk about the work we were doing and the clients we were working with and our own frustrations with just the experience of athletes. And, it was at that time that we kind of joked around that we should write a book. And, it took 10 years, I guess, for that to kind of simmer a bit for us to get to a point where we started making moves towards that. And that's a fun memory now to look back on and realize that this really was in motion much longer than I think we had realized initially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess it was just not just the writing point, but just how did the process work with taking the sort of the qualitative research and the lived experience, and then collaborating with Erin too as well to sort of produce what I thought was a very just I had a strong through line through all of it as a narrative.
Oh, thank you for that. That's helpful to hear. It was one of those things that once we started writing, we really realized, this has been on our hearts longer than we've been actively working on it, because a lot of the ideas and concepts really just poured out. And then we were really fortunate to get connected with focus groups and those that kind of shared in the mission to be able to build upon some of the research and stories and formal interviews that we did to be able to share the stories within the book. It was an amazing collaboration. One of those things we hadn't all worked together before. So to, dive into a massive project like this, the teamwork was out of this world. We each had our strengths, and we found really quickly what each of our roles were and what, between the three of us, we were going to bring to the team and how that was going to operate. And we worked efficiently together, and it was a really fulfilling experience in that sense, because it was hard to hear the stories. It was sad to see some of the areas in which the system still needs to generate change. And I can't imagine doing it in isolation. So being able to work with Tiffany and Erin on it was really a privilege.
Yeah. And just to elaborate for our audience, what does the word heaviness mean in the context of doing all that research and collecting all that heartfelt testimony of some of the traumas, sports women have faced on the regular throughout their, athletic careers?
Well, I think, as two therapists who have sat in rooms with thousands of people and heard, the depth of their pain and suffering, as, that's a career that we signed up for, and we're, quite well versed in being able to sit in the pain with other people. There was something different about the book process that, the heaviness translated to parts of ourselves that I think we really hadn't experienced before with our clients. And partly because what we're hearing from the women that we interviewed were stories that we knew were preventable. We knew that what they went through could have been different. And to hear the pain and suffering that they were dealing with, heavy is just the best way to describe it. And it was, there were days that Katie and I would hop on calls together or send text messages of just feeling down and out by what we were experiencing, and knowing that we were trained to be in those conversations. And yet we too were greatly impacted by what we were hearing.
Yeah. And I always sort of say there's, as I try to work to be an ally and, a good brother to my sister who's in sports, and want to be a good uncle if my niece Riley shows interest in sports. She's 3 and she already can run and stride and kick the soccer ball. So that's a good sign. I guess just how when did you sort of, how many, I just want to know, maybe ballpark figure. I mean, typical guy, I got to put everything in math terms, that even though I was a very bad math student. How many hundreds, thousands of people did you probably interview in doing this and gathering all the research?
It really was countless people. And I think, one of the things that was challenging was determining what stories get included in the book, because we couldn't include every story. What we ended up hearing were certain themes. And so we would take the themes that we were hearing amongst the athletes and kind of putting them in buckets in that way. And the sad reality is there were so many stories, they couldn't even all fit into a book. And as we would talk to one athlete, they would connect us to another athlete. And so it was kind of this linking, and it was remarkable that so many people were open to sharing their stories in the hopes of being able to contribute to the change that we all know is possible, that their sport is an amazing place. And with some modifications, people can leave sport healthier than when they entered, versus needing to do some of this healing, which we heard over and over from the athletes that we interviewed, and coaches too.
Mm-hmm. And to what extent, you can tell, is this about, there's always that, like right now I'm in a place where the temperature, the humidex, it feels like it's almost like 95 Fahrenheit, and people are like, well, it was hot when I went to school. How much is this about reminding people, hey, life is not a suffering competition, and just because I went through something, I don't want the next generation to go through it?
I think that's a huge part of it, in the sense that, there's kind of this way that coaches will coach, of kind of, this is how I was coached up, and so this is how I'm going to do it. There's not, really great training to learn to be a coach. Some coaches go out and find professional development opportunities, or they've been exposed to really great leadership that have shown them how to do it. But I've been thrust into coaching when I was younger. I was a 17-year-old and was coaching, 12-year-olds in basketball, and not a single person gave me information about how to do that. And so when we're talking about the well-being of others, and we're considering how to show up for their stress and the things that happen for athletes because they're carrying such a significant load. Kind of the old school ways is just a really, as we would put it, kind of a cop out in some perspectives, that, you know, there's better ways to interact with humans to get better results. And that's kind of the paradox of it all, is if there are coaches that are willing to do things differently, and to learn different strategies, better strategies, they're going to get way more out of their athletes than they're getting now, which is actually going to be the thing that's going to get them the performance that they are hoping to get by their old school methods.
I guess that's the sort of, can be, if I'm paring that down in my mind, it's the difference between transformative and transactional a bit, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. And, you know, we had a lot of coaches tell us in the process that they believed we were trying to make sports soft by integrating mental health, for exactly the question you asked Tiffany, which was, well, I did it that way and I was able to make it through, and you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And the story that wasn't told is the long-term implications of that. And that's the story we really wanted to tell in The Price She Pays, is that even though people can get through a scenario or a circumstance or mistreatment, we know we can do it better, which can leave humans more intact and also lead to better performance. If there is more of this transformation happening, or this means of connection, attunement, versus just having it be transactional, kind of more of these conveyor belt systems.
Yeah, and maybe for either of you, like what is the? I've had this conversation with friends of mine who have 12-year-old children, but what is the downside, I guess, of having that outcome-based thinking when you're in sports, like when you're focusing on the result instead of, am I doing this in a healthful way? What's the sort of the therapist analysis of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, we would argue that it can be both. I mean, the beauty of sport is the outcome. I mean, I'm the first to, beg my favorite sports teams to be better, do better. And, I want that championship as a fan, just like anybody else. It's really about adding, not very much, but adding some components to the typical athletics process so that the well-being of the athlete is cared for along the way. But that also includes really intense outcomes. And being able to ask a lot of athletes, it has to come with some attention to well-being. And if that attention is given, then the outcome gets to be kind of a higher level or a higher expectation. And oftentimes there is this belief that it has to be one or the other. And, the therapist's viewpoint on that is multiple things can exist at once. And we can expect a lot out of somebody and still give them care and concern and respect along the way. And that's oftentimes the misinterpretation of turning towards well-being for athletes, is that if it's intense, then it's also disrespectful. And that's essentially the thesis of our argument, is ensuring that we're able to kind of hold both really effectively.
Mm-hmm. So what does a sports world where that mental health component is, front and center, but it's still, let's face it, judged on the results, wins and losses. What does that look like compared to what it looks like in the present?
Yeah, we need a framework, right? And we oftentimes use the example of, if an athlete tears their ACL or breaks their ankle, the athletic system knows how to respond. And while mental health can present very differently for each athlete, we need a system and protocol in place so that systems aren't having to scramble when an athlete has a mental health need, because early intervention works with mental health. And if we can have this level of awareness, then rather than waiting till symptomology gets so acute and then intervening, if we can move further down the ladder, we can be more proactive, versus right now what's happening is it is so reactive that athletes are getting really severe symptomology before the system intervenes. So we need to have a framework that's integrated so that at the earliest indicator of mental health needs, there's intervention occurring.
Yeah. And just building off that, I know, Tiffany, you work with the University of Oregon. What would be the ratio of, mental health practitioners to like trainers, athletic therapists, team doctors at the University of Oregon in Eugene?
Yeah, I mean, to put that in perspective, there's about 500 or so student athletes on campus. And if any one of those athletes were to break an ankle or maybe even turn their ankle in practice or even in a game, they would immediately be seen for that physical condition. If I am a student athlete and seeking out mental health support, I'm usually waiting on a wait list. And I'm usually waiting to be seen for an actual appointment. And so it is not automatic. It is not per team. It is, the amount of trainers and doctors that are available to each team is probably the amount of mental health people that are available to the entire athletic department. And that's the ratio that needs to be different is, the moment that someone is struggling and is seeking out support, it needs to be available to them. And what's hard to kind of make sense of for a lot of people is that, for a large university, for a D1 large university, there are lots of therapists on campus that are doing that work. But what isn't talked about is those people are serving the rest of the student body. And so, yes, there's a counseling center. Yes, it is staffed with a lot of people. And that's true for most universities in terms of, supplying support to the general campus. But the services for athletes need to be different and need to be available to them. Just like if I were to break an ankle in a game that I am seen immediately, maybe even at halftime, that's the kind of immediacy that we're talking about that needs to change.
Yeah, and sometimes there's the messaging to athletes matters too, right? I can think of, when I've had my struggles with depression, thinking, well, I'm not that bad. And my friend goes, well, if you sprained your ankle, would you not go to the ER? Because, well, someone else might be in there with waiting for a broken leg. So how much does the messaging have to go to athletes to say, you just can't tough your way through depression? I mean, you have to be, you are tough for admitting that you need some help, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think, there's still so much shame, even though we're seeing progress and accessibility increase for mental health services, there's still a lot of stigma attached to it in terms of there's a weakness, or maybe if you just grit your way through it or work harder. And it's really one of the things that makes this my favorite topic is that coexistence, that paradox of what is required to be an elite athlete is a level of dissociation and disconnect from self and body. And what is required for optimized mental health is deep, deep connection to self. And what we need to help athletes learn is that those can coexist, that you can have both of those abilities. It isn't going to make you soft. It isn't going to make you weak. It's actually going to be able to enhance your performance, because rather than trying to operate in fifth gear all the time and then burning out, you're going to know how to downshift to be able to connect to self and then be able to push even harder, because you will have downshifted to recover and check in and intervene early when you notice things, right? It's like a stress fracture in that sense, right? If you notice the pain and the twinge in your foot and you ignore it and you keep running and you push through, it doesn't actually make you tougher. What ends up happening, and I can say from lived experience, is you push through and your foot breaks, and then you're in a boot for 9 months because you didn't pay attention to some of those earlier warning signs that you could have prevented the foot from breaking had you just taken a couple weeks off. It wouldn't have been 9 months. It would have been a couple weeks instead.
Yeah, and of course I'm assuming that's coming right back to your days as an NCAA D1 cross country and track and field athlete. I take it.
Yeah.
So why are, there's all sorts of professions that have different vulnerabilities. Why are sportswomen, and that's just sort of the all around term I use for female identifying athletes, why are they sort of especially vulnerable to falling into the thing of anxiety and perfectionism? I think that's addressed a lot in this book.
Yeah, I think there's two parts of that in terms of considering the role of kind of the stressors. For one, being an athlete doesn't mean that you don't have stressors and that you're not dealing with the things that all of us are dealing with on a daily basis, just by being human in the world. And so there's this kind of kind of misunderstanding that athletes have, they have all the accolades, they have all the access, they have all the stardom, that how could they possibly be depressed or anxious or perfectionistic? And so part of it is acknowledging that no matter what you're doing as a profession, you're going to be dealing with the ups and downs of just being in the world. What we know for athletes in women's sports is that they're dealing with a huge set of complexities that oftentimes those in men's sport are not dealing with. And so they're being compared to men as the basis of kind of their greatness. They're being told kind of over and over again about their belonging in sport in negative ways. For example, last night in our event, we were, and this was like not surprising to Katie and I whatsoever, but it illuminates the story of there was an intense rugby player who was, I think, training or practice. They have a national championship coming up. A New York team that is a national championship contender, and they have to share space for their practice field with a social soccer club for men. And so this is, when we're looking at what that looks like for women to kind of move their way into existence in terms of the greatness of sports, they're continued to be seen as secondary. And so, whether that someone wakes up in the morning and goes, that's the reason that I'm having so much stress, that accumulates over time when that messaging continues to be given. And so it's like a, death of 1,000 paper cuts in that way. And then compound that by just the experiences of being an athlete and navigating the expectations and the perfectionistic ways of needing to find that greatness, that is going to take a toll on a person. And when we consider what that looks like from the experience of women, it's extraordinary.
Yeah. And how much is it a case of it already takes a friend of mine, who coaches, he's coached high school girls rugby up here in Canada, and he's coached wrestling. And he always says, when I coach boys, I would always have boys quit, but girls never quit because they had already crossed that threshold of, the stigma of social stigma of being an athlete. And I guess once you how much is it a case of once you've already made that decision, it seems like a point of no return. Sometimes it must be, I guess.
Yeah, of finding that place and finding that community, and women have to fight so hard to find it that once you're in it, then you found your people and you've created basically a place of belonging. I think, those bonds can be deep. And we heard that story after story of even women who had faced really acute trauma in sport still feel a deep love because of some of the bonds that they formed with their teammates or with a trainer or wherever they found that point of contact. It can be a real sense of identity and place of belonging when it can be created. And so I think you're bringing up an interesting point in terms of having to fight so hard for something, the level of commitment that comes with that. It requires a whole person. We met a high school basketball player in the book writing process, and she said, if you're a female athlete, you have to be a marketer, right? So there are so many roles for females that creates a thing all of its own. Absolutely.
That marketer comment sort of brings me around to a question I was going to ask about a particular, athlete, and she doesn't play basketball, but I'm getting to that. I can't open a certain social media site without seeing a reel of the gymnast Livy Dunn. I guess this is sort of almost like a 3-part thing. How much has sort of social media been a bit of an equalizer in showing, yes, people do pay attention to these sports women more than men, but it's also at the same time it's exposing a lot of sort of fault lines in the culture. And how much is sort of Livy Dunn, the gymnast and social media superstar, like an example of that?
Yeah, I think it's given women a platform to demonstrate what the people around them already know, and which is women can be fierce and they can find, a zone of their own that can bring stardom and star power. My nephews know about Livy Dunn, and they talk about kind of her incredible capacity as a gymnast, and the fact that they know about her is because of the power and intrinsic motivation that Livy has, which is incredible. I think it's about how we consume social media and what we expect then of Livy because of that. And I think that's a lot on the consumer around, what we do with the way that, her platform is used, or what we assume about her because of her platform. I see an incredibly strong, brave, courageous, just powerful woman who has found a platform all of her own and a zone all of her own, that the fact that she's landing in a conversation right now that you're asking about her and we know about her, which is, I think, speaks to her prowess. That to me is pretty incredible. And at the same time, frustrating that women have to work so hard for her to be in a conversation. And then oftentimes what comes next is the critique of her because she's found a way to put herself in the conversation. And that's, I think, the experiences of women in women's sports.
Yeah, I think I saw some graphic and it compared her followers and then her boyfriend, Paul Skeens, is a pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and showed how many followers he has. And it should be like, well, shouldn't he be trying a little bit harder? Or it shows how far baseball's fallen off the map, I think, with anyone under 30. So now we try to be evergreen, but I also try to be, topics in my head sort of bring up questions when I'm reading the books. For each of you, what would the conversations about Caitlin Clark and her rookie year in the WNBA sort of look like if the league itself and a lot of the media commenting on it were not, and I'm using a quote from the book here, an arena created for men and by men? I mean, I guess the NBA is, but the WNBA is, created with was created supplementally to the NBA originally, and now it's standing on its own. But I just wondered how those conversations would be different if the institutions were a little bit more equal.
Yeah, Tiffany and I talk about that frequently, right? And I think one of the things that we often come back to, whether it's Caitlin Clark or the first woman to be a coach in the NHL or a female athletic director or a female coaching in the NFL, is it's so sad, right? Of like Caitlin Clark, we all are like she's like this one-off. And in reality, there's tons of talented female athletes. And yet we, as a society, what we see in the media is one. And I think that's where we oftentimes have conversation around, wow, it's so sad that this is a story. It's so sad. Like, she is worth celebrating and she is out of this world. She deserves every ounce of credibility that she is getting, hands down. And this should be the norm for women in sport. There should be conversation. We should know who they are. We should have household names of female athletes. We should know it should be unremarkable that women are coaching. That should just be part of the equation in a sports system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess that comes back to the historical perspective. Because sometimes, when I'm looking at what's happening now, I'm just like, why wasn't it? I know there's deeper answers that are, beyond my pay grade, but I'm always like, why couldn't it have always been like this? Or what did we cost ourselves over the last, 90, 120 years? So is it fair to think of it that way? Or is it just adding another, layer to, inequities that are still out there in the system?
I think the inequities are still large. And I think it's there's a misconception in some ways that, women have arrived. And this last year in terms of women's basketball has certainly made strides. But that also was because there was incredible investment. There was more TV coverage. There was more media coverage. If you turned on a women's basketball game, there were multiple cameras that were showing, the action differently than how women were covered years ago, where it was almost like a single camera following women up and down the court. That's a different way of watching sports. And so those investments are made, inevitably women show up every single time and prove that investment is important. And over and over again, the women who are stars and the women who came before them have been saying that all along. But when we're investing heavily in men's sports with money and media time and television, and then we say, oh my gosh, everyone just loves men's sports, we're not looking back at the formula in a critical way. People love sports, period. But we got to be able to throw, the same resources at it so they all have a fighting chance. And then if we don't, that's where those inequities will continue to stay.
And I guess what does the book show about what's the best business model? Because there's so many differences across, from the WNBA to, pro soccer leagues in North America and Europe, and of course the new professional women's hockey league. What is the best way forward in that regard?
Forward, for sure. We need to keep going. We need to, I think, including women in that conversation of what is going to help you perform the best, consulting women in the creation of those leagues and programs. Angel City did an amazing job of this, of creating something outside of what we know, right? We're trying to do this plug and play model in terms of, okay, well, here's what worked with the NBA. Let's see if it's going to work with the WNBA. And it's like, weird. But there's a lot of differences. So we have to create something new rather than just thinking we're going to just do what we did with men and then be surprised why it's not working. We have to ask women and we have to trust them to guide the conversation to get them to where they need to be.
And sometimes that might involve speaking up, saying, well, maybe we should try something differently, even if it's still a slight tweak in the game rules, right? One way or the other. The PWHL was actually, in some regards, was a good example of that. Now, how do we sort of square this circle? There is, like I say, all this new investment, that great quote from Billie Jean King about that. And at the same time, the book has a strong theme about women's health care and these, coordinated political attacks, as I say, stripping women, transgender and non-binary people in large swaths of the United States of the right to decide when to have a family or receive gender-affirming care. We have this issue in Canada. I just wonder how can we allow those two things that are so in opposition to coexist? That seems very counterintuitive to me.
Can you say a bit more about your question, Nathan?
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
I guess I just wonder how what does it show or illustrate when, like I say, there's all this new investment in women's sports at the same time in large parts of the U.S. and it's occurring in Canada too. There's all these attacks on sort of like reproductive health and gender affirming care that are clearly coordinated to happen. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's no way for anything political to stop and go away. I mean, I think that's just the vernacular, and that's what we're, the times that we're living in and have been living in. And so, part of the task of anyone who cares about women's sports and most notably around the mental health or well-being of women's sports is knowing that those conversations are happening outside. How we handle within sport is what's so important. And what was dynamite for us as writers for The Price She Pays was wanting to ensure that the conversation about healthcare, the conversation about well-being, the conversation about, women directing their futures comes back to the athlete and women themselves, and ensuring that regardless of kind of what's happening politically in the world, that we're turning towards athletes and ensuring that they have what they need and not having that kind of drive it. So I think in many ways it can be counterintuitive, but I think the coexisting of that is central. And, Katie and I talk with our clients all the time as kind of the kind of cornerstone of therapy, knowing that multiple things are going to coexist at once, and how do we cope with that and how do we handle that, and that's what we're asking for as kind of the premise of the book, is being able to notice that these major conversations are happening out in the world. How do we ensure that women are cared for? How do we ensure that athletes who are navigating their gender identity and expression and trying to figure out kind of their own identity in the world, how do we ensure that they have a place in sport? Because we know how beautiful sport can be. And we don't want people to have to walk away from sport because of the intensity that is happening as you're talking about from this political direction.
Yeah, and I from what I gather, and I'm, as a Canadian who does follow a fair number of NCAA sports, it's seems to be a real something the NCAA doesn't even really want to have a policy position on. Am I going too far in saying that?
Yeah, we lack protocol. We lack, anything that falls under this mental health umbrella. There is not a system in place for athletes, period. In the NCAA, in, trickle down, if we look at professional leagues, there isn't an infrastructure in place. We are operating from this best practices model, and that still leaves programs floundering of who can be involved, who cannot be involved, how do we respond, what is athlete well-being really going to mean, and how are we going to integrate that into our program? There isn't a clear response. Again, coming back to this reactive state versus being able to be proactive. And that's where we really need to see a shift. We need to become more proactive and early intervention aligned so that it can be, the agreements can be very, very clear. And right now that is not the case.
Yeah. And I guess I took do the other piece of that I want to touch on was sort of the reproductive health and maternal health care. How much ground has to be made up? I think I saw in the last month in Europe, FIFA, I think, said that, okay, we're going to cover things, but I get the sense that it's still lagging in a lot of areas of this. I'm thinking more at the pro level or national team level.
Yeah, I think there's a significant lag is, looking at how do we protect women in terms of, being involved in sport or, looking specifically at, brands who are saying we're not going to support your contract if you are pregnant. And so, these expectations that are put on women to make decisions versus, again, those things can coexist. And they can coexist really methodically and effectively. And unfortunately, there's been a significant impact on women being able to make decisions for themselves regarding their healthcare, regarding kind of maternal wellness, knowing that they are working within a world that is dominated mostly by decision makers who are men who are not turning towards the needs of women. And that's one of the things in the book that was so important to us, is to illustrate the challenges that women have been up against as they've had to navigate, I want to be an elite athlete. I want to, focus and train and compete in these incredible ways. But what does it look like when I also want to have a family? And will my brand, will my sponsorships, will my sport give me what I need so that I can do that? And unfortunately for many, they have not received what they've needed to be able to move forward with their own family planning. Yeah.
And how much of a sense is there that maybe the generation that's, in their 20s now and coming into their careers, that they might not stand for this? Like they're saying, I don't want to wait till I'm done playing and not have it and delay, starting a family. And how much of a sense do you get that there's a social shift taking place there?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're hoping for. And there's been a ton of female athletes who have been huge advocates for that, right? We will see a shift from their advocacy, and they've taken to policies and to their brands, and they have left sponsorships in with the intention to make a change for the next generation. And we're absolutely seeing that, right? It's creating some level of systems of accountability for brands that female athletes aren't either just going to step away if they want to have a family or prolong that process when whatever that's going to end up meaning. Women have really started laying the groundwork for that. So I think the coming generations will benefit from that work.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's also like maybe people a little slightly younger than us are, they're into coaching now. I wanted to ask, when a coach, there's a great chapter in the book on body image and eating disorders. And as I think sort of focuses on why, girls will stop playing sports when they sort of go through bodily changes. I guess I want to know, what should the conversation sound like when a coach is talking to, say, like a preteen girl in a way that, again, from the book, emphasizes strength, recovery, and mastery of skills instead of appearance or weight? How does that conversation begin, and how should it flow?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is being able to turn towards young girls and give them the accolades that they deserve. It's turning towards and saying, wow, that was an incredible game. You're so strong. Or your capacity to, make that play was so amazing and significant. Being able to notice what people are doing in terms of their sports capacity is not a new skill. It's what we do to young boys and young men all the time. And so being able to translate that over to women's sports should be fairly easy for people, but instead we focus, unfortunately, too much on, how women look and does their body kind of fit the sport, and they're too muscular, or they're not muscular enough. And part of that is how we've all been socialized in terms of women get to be on the other end of people's kind of gaze and their own opinions. And, so unfortunately, it doesn't happen the way that it should, but people have the skill set to do it because they're doing it with boys all the time. And so all we're really saying is to be able to translate that skill set and to be able to sit with young girls and be able to notice their, how hard they hit the ball, how fast, they read the defense, like whatever's happening in terms of the sport, that's where we want them to get their attention, so that what they're noticing for themselves is also their capacity as an athlete, not how they looked or how other people thought that they looked. And our hope is that that's one of those kind of small changes that can add up to a pretty significant impact.
Mm-hmm. And as you're saying that, Tiffany, I'm thinking of, like, say, my 3-year-old niece, and I always have a little Swedish phrase for her, den starka flicken med rött hår, the strong girl with the red hair.
Right.
Now,
right.
One thing too, I think a phrase we encountered in a couple episodes back was the notion of practice without mastery in your own lives and your own, what have you sort of observed about youth sports kind of losing the plot with that, and some of the perfectionism that starts to creep in on kids when they get into organized leagues?
Yeah, absolutely. And the long-term implications of that, right? Of expecting kids to there's no margin for error. They need to choose their sport early. They need to stick with that sport then indefinitely. And what we really want to see is kids having the confidence to be able to trust themselves so that they have maneuverability, so that they can fail, and that can be okay. Failing is part of sport, right? My oldest son is 9, and I sit at the baseball games and a kid strikes out and collectively the fans are like, oh. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's just like part of it, right? Like kids are gonna strike out. And I guess my hope for my kids and this generation of athletes coming up is that they're okay failing, that they trust themselves enough and that they have the confidence to take the risk to fail and then find their way, because they will, but nothing is linear. But they can't be afraid of failing. There isn't ever really mastery, right? Like we are all constantly learning.
Yeah. And another, I think, when you're looking at the sort of the guide through this, fraught world, and we want people to buy the book and pick it up because it's really good.
Thank you.
But you have a great section on social media use. What's the best way to sort of, adapt to the reality that, the generation, like a kid born in 2012, that they're basically born with a phone in their hand? There's surely got to be a better way than just making some big announcement. Okay, cell phones are banned in schools, because I don't think we're getting that toothpaste back in the tube.
That's exactly right. And I think, to some surprise in conversations that Katie and I have had over the last couple of years, talking about this very thing, is we are advocates to help kids use social media and use their phones in moderation. It doesn't help to just decide, get them out of kids' hands or get them out of schools. Like you're saying, it's a part of what is already happening. And so instead of a ban, or instead of, cutting it off, having conversations, being in the nuance of it, of saying, let's talk about the use of social media. Let's talk about how you feel when you're, scrolling through Instagram. What do you notice if you're on it for a long period of time versus a short period of time? And, being able to help kids be in those conversations with themselves to, understand their own experiences and to moderate their own experiences, that's the job of us as adults to help them do that. They're not going to be born with that decision making and that capacity to understand, like, oh, if I look at Instagram for, an hour, TikTok for an hour, and then I'm kind of grumpy and cranky afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're not going to draw that conclusion. That's where we can have those conversations. The other piece of that I think we miss is our own modeling of it. And so, parents or caregivers or aunts and uncles or whoever's, around kids, I watch this sometimes happen where there's a parent telling a kid that they should be off their social media while they have their own phone in their hand and they're doing something else. And, the irony is not lost on us in those moments. And
Mm-hmm.
to be able to model and to come up with other ways to spend time is important as a family, or even just in conversation with kids. But we also just have to be in the conversation with them versus give them a rule and expect them to follow it. That's helpful in some ways, but it's not enough. Kids need to understand, they have questions and they can learn, but we've got to be in the conversation with them.
Yeah, and believe it or not, they actually made a big announcement in the province where I live saying, yeah, this is banned. And it's like, really? Who's going to enforce it? When you have 35 children in a class. Now, I sort of did want to wind down soon, but I did want to ask, both of you have the connection to the Oregon Ducks. Tiffany, as a consultant and a teacher to their athletics program regarding mental health, Oregon's in the Big Ten now. And I'm looking, at the women's soccer schedule, and I think on September 22nd, they're going to be playing an away game, a league game, 2,800 miles from campus. How is what's the collective preparation like that to make sure sleep is so important for mental health? How's that all built in? How is that being accounted for? I guess is what I'm asking. A little progress report.
It's, I think that's part of what's to be seen, is how these systems adapt to these big decisions. And it's a great example of how a system made a decision specifically for financial gain and hadn't really thought through the complexities of what this would look like for athletes to be traveling, like you said, 2,800 miles for a league game and turn around and come back. And, and looking at what that means in terms of airports and layovers. These teams are not equipped with charter planes. That is not something that every team gets to have. That is a privilege that is oftentimes given to one team at a university. And so there's a lot of work to be done to help athletes kind of readjust to this. The hope is that, it means something really positive in the long run in terms of, hopefully, fingers crossed, some kickback to athletes in terms of them being seen across the country, on Big Ten networks versus Pac-12. There's, who knows where that will go. But yeah, sleep is a major component. How a body feels because it's been in an airport for a really long time, or it's been sitting on a plane for a really long time. Those are things that are going to need to be adjusted for. And, you know, those conversations are happening. I think there will need to be a lot of adjustments along the way in order to best serve the athlete. But the schedules are going to be grueling and it's going to be tough on them, no doubt. And unfortunately, most of the women's teams are probably going to suffer a bit more because that's typically how the systems are set up in terms of the way that sports go.
Yeah, and I guess my one question I did want to squeeze in was, and it was reacting to something Erin Strout had your fellow author had retweeted. What suppose either of you would get to be commissioner of all NCAA sports day one? What would be your first act be as part of that full blown redesign that would be more gender equitable?
Mental health integration.
Okay.
Because then we can look at the whole person. We aren't just focusing on the outcome. We'd be tending to what the human experience is, and we are outcome driven. So that isn't a piece that we want to see go away, but we want to see the athlete being equally as valued as a human, not just for their performance. So the ripple effect of mental health integration is really, really significant.
Yeah,
Perfect.
I think that, day one as a leader of such a huge organization, first off, I don't know that you could pay me enough to take that job. But if that were to ever come to fruition, the hope would be to do exactly what Katie's saying, that mental health integration is number one. And, it also means that the integration is mandated. It's expected. Teams and colleges are supposed to have people on staff that are attending to physical injuries. And if we're not mandating that same expectation for mental health, we're really, really missing the big picture. And it can't be suggestions. It can't be best practices, which is what's happening now. It needs to be mandated and it needs to be measured and it needs to have accountability. The other thing I would add to that I think is missing is there needs to be a very clear code of ethics for coaches and coaching staff and teams. Katie and I, as licensed mental health practitioners, are under incredible scrutiny with our jobs on a regular basis in terms of our ethics, and we are accountable to a board of our peers who receive complaints from consumers to ensure that those of us that are in the world are practicing ethically and legally. And we need to see that same set of expectations at the level of coaching and teams. And without it, then we just continue to be pumping, athletes through to be able to mandate or manage getting, more dollars in people's hands. And we really miss the well-being of the athlete, which, really should be the center of our attention and our focus if we truly love sports as much as we all say that we do.
And to reiterate what you said earlier, that and being driven and competitive are not in an opposition to each other.
They're really not. And I think that, oftentimes that is, the big misconception, and knowing that those two can coexist. And I think, Katie and I are great examples of it. We, even just in writing this book, we were focused on the outcome. We needed and wanted to get this book out there. And we were on a timeline. We had expectations along the way. We had high expectations for each other. And yet we still attended to each other's, well-being as we went along. We checked in. We asked, how are you doing? How are you managing this? Can I take something so that you can take a rest day? So even within our own experience, we practiced what we preached, and we had a hard time. We had our own ups and downs and stressors along the way. And, it did not sacrifice outcome for us to pause and check in with each other and to navigate the process from that perspective.
And I should have asked this way sooner, but what was the process like of finding the right publisher with Little Brown and Spark as you realized what you had, the material that you had, and the message.
Yeah, we were so lucky. I'll say it over and over again. Thank our lucky stars that we got connected with the agent, the literary agent, Susan, right out of the gates. And she has just been a North Star throughout the entire project and helped us through the proposal stage and the auction stage of getting paired with a publisher. So she has, she has been remarkable. I will sing her praises all day long.
Excellent. And I guess to close out, I was hoping each of you could sort of explain the work you do with the Athletes Mental Health Foundation and how anyone who needs it might seek it out online.
You can find the website at athletesmentalhealthfoundation.org. And it was really created out of this passion to have solutions and tools ready and tangible for anyone who needs it. Katie and I have such a strong passion to ensure that we're not just out naming problems without cultivating solutions. And so, the website has a significant amount of trainings and videos that we've done with each other and with guests, handouts, information. So that way folks who are wondering about these things or wanting to make a difference in their own kind of small bubble of athletics can do so, and they can find those resources ready to be implemented regardless of the role that they have in sports.
Yes, and Katie, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, we've throughout the process just wanted to fill in some of the gaps, right? And as we went through the price she pays process, we learned that there were still a few gaps, and that's where Athletes Mental Health Foundation was created. We know that systems are tasked with so much and want to alleviate some of that burden of them having to create the wheel, and so we are trying to help them co-create that.
Awesome. So, thank you so much for your time today, Katie and Tiffany. Again, for our listenership, readership too, because I have a Substack. The book is The Price She Pays, Confronting the Hidden Mental Health Crisis in Women's Sports from the Schoolyard to the Stadium, and it's available from Little, Brown, and Smart. Thank you so much. This has been excellent, I hope.
Thank you.